Jackie and her husband, Ed, appeared to be a typical suburban couple.
Totally normal, regular folks.
They just had a great life. They had a beautiful home.
The perfect marriage.
But then Ed was brutally murdered.
3 shots point blank to the head.
She was devastated.
I didn't know what to think.
The investigation would uncover the sordid secrets behind their perfect marriage.
No one knew whose baby it was.
She had been introduced as his girlfriend.
He goes, I may actually leave her.
And those secrets would eventually lead them back to Jackie.
You know what this looks like? That you set this up.
August 20th, 2000, Manatee County, Florida. It was around 7:30 a.m. as a woman looking for somewhere to pull over and change her baby's diaper approached the tiny crossroads of Duet, about 45 miles southeast of Tampa.
It's in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I cannot stress how middle of nowhere.
Finally, after several minutes of searching, there was a sign up ahead.
A convenience store called the Oasis. Perfect name for this place because there's nothing out there.
But when she pulled into the deserted parking lot, her relief turned to horror. A man's dead body lay sprawled on the asphalt in a pool of blood.
He'd sustained several gunshot wounds to the head. He'd also had his throat slashed.
It was very brutal.
The woman called 911, and Manatee County deputies were on the scene within minutes. A search of the pickup truck parked near the body revealed that the dead man's name was Edward Postma.
His wallet was found inside his truck. There was no indication that anything had been taken. There didn't appear to be anything missing from it.
But if robbery wasn't a motive, how did the 32-year-old mechanic from Bradenton end up dead in a parking lot more than 30 miles from home?
All we really know is that he apparently drove himself to this convenience store at Duet, and we know that he was shot, and we know that his throat was cut, and we know that he died from those injuries. Beyond that, we don't know much.
For the moment, all the investigators could do was contact Ed's next of kin and hope that they could provide some answers. And they started with the dead man's wife, 30-year-old Jackie Postma. Jackie Lee Gordner was born in upstate New York in 1970, but spent most of her childhood in Florida.
We moved to Florida before she was a year old.
The family settled in the small central Florida town of Auburndale.
It's between Tampa and Orlando. Very just laid-back neighborhood. You know, one of those just come home when it's getting dark kind of neighborhoods.
It was the perfect setting for what was, for the most part, an idyllic childhood.
When she was in 5th grade, I was in kindergarten. She'd take me to school on the bicycle.
She was outgoing. She liked to talk. She was funny. She was just an average kid. She liked to run and ride bikes.
However, there was one thing Jackie didn't like: school.
Jackie hated school from the day she went to kindergarten. She quit school when she was 16.
As a high school dropout, her prospects were limited.
She worked around at odd jobs.
Like a grocery store or a convenience store or like a Kmart.
Jackie didn't have a career, but soon after dropping out of high school, she did have a baby and an ex-husband.
She was married and divorced and had a kid by the time she was 18.
They ended up giving it up for adoption.
And by the time she was 19, she'd had another baby, the product of yet another failed relationship.
Her second son's father, who she never married, she left him.
Jackie did keep her second baby, but she was struggling to raise him as a single mother when she met Ed Postma in 1990. Like Jackie, Ed wasn't a Florida native, and that wasn't the only similarity they shared.
He was still in high school when we moved down here, but he never completed high school.
But unlike Jackie, Ed had focused on work, pursuing what would be his lifelong passion.
He seemed to be linked with cars. He had worked as a mechanic trainee for a period of time. He worked as a detailer at an automotive dealership.
In fact, it was Ed's fascination with automobiles that eventually led him to meet 20-year-old Jackie.
She got a job at a trucking school where they teach truck mechanics.
Jackie worked in the school office, and Ed, then 23, was one of its standout students.
Ed was very outgoing. He loved people.
And people generally loved him back, especially women.
Now, he's the guy that could walk into a party, meet a girl, and they could be paired off in about 20 minutes. He was just so confident, and that just seemed to, attract the girls pretty quickly.
That was certainly true of Jackie.
She was kind of a flirt.
They hit it right off. They never separated after that.
Not permanently, at least, although there was a brief breakup early on.
A few months after they were dating, Ed decided he was going to see other girls.
Jackie, with 2 failed relationships behind her already, was determined to win Ed back.
She would come banging on doors and windows saying, "Ed, I know you're in there. Ed, I know you're in there."
Her persistence paid off, and Jackie and Ed eventually patched things up.
He decided to go back with her.
And 4 years into their relationship, the couple moved to Bradenton, Florida, 45 miles down the coast from Tampa.
The Pirates have their spring training there. It's a nice little Florida town.
Ed took a job as a mechanic with a local trucking firm.
Ed worked there working on the big rigs.
Jackie, meanwhile, focused on raising her 5-year-old son, whom Ed also doted on.
He treated Jackie's son like he was his own, took him everywhere. They did everything together.
And in 1995, when Jackie was 25, Ed proposed.
They'd been together 5 years before they got married.
2 years after that, Jackie and Ed had a child of their own, a baby girl.
She was, the light of her father's life.
And with a new baby crowded into their apartment, the family moved again to a complex in the Bradenton suburb of Palmetto.
They lived there probably about a year and a half.
At least until the trucking company promoted Ed.
Ended up becoming a shop manager for him, supervisor over many mechanics.
Ed was a great provider, made really good money.
Ed was making enough money that Jackie was able to quit work and stay home with the kids.
She made a little money on the side, baking cakes and pies and cookies and stuff, but not a lot. He really didn't push her to work.
And in 1999, 4 years after their marriage, Ed and Jackie were even able to buy their first home, a modest rancher in Fresh Meadows.
Ed was working hard at putting up a really pretty fence so they'd have a nice fenced-in, safe backyard for the kids. It was just an adorable little home.
Very quiet, loving atmosphere. That's what I really felt from it.
But it may have been a little too quiet for Jackie, who seemed to have a little trouble adjusting to her new surroundings.
She was always at the apartment complex where they had just moved from. And I said, well, isn't she making friends around her neighborhood with her neighbors or anything since she doesn't work? He goes, no, she likes to hang out at the apartment complex.
Other than that, however, Jackie and Ed were just another middle-class suburban couple.
Ed went to work every day and worked hard at a trucking company. Jackie stayed home, took care of the children.
Took care of the house, cooked, cleaned. Totally normal, regular folks.
Right down to their hobbies.
He stripped down and rebuilt drag bikes. He swapped motors and cars.
She collected porcelain dolls, and she must have had 40 of them.
And despite their rocky start, 5 years into their marriage, most of their friends and family figured Jackie and Ed had become a couple to be envied.
I thought Jackie and Ed had, the perfect marriage.
They just had a great life. They had a beautiful home. They didn't have the fanciest stuff, but what they had was theirs.
Everything was going in the right direction.
Which made what was coming even more of a shock.
bam, out of nowhere, he got murdered.
Coming up, Jackie is devastated by the news of Ed's death.
She has no idea why her husband would have been out at the Oasis at that time of night.
And the investigation has her facing some tough questions.
I have to tell you what was said, and I need to get your response.
Manatee County, Florida, August 20th, 2000. It was around 7:30 that Sunday morning when a passerby discovered Ed Postma's dead body sprawled in the parking lot of a rural convenience store called the Oasis.
It's one of the most remote parts of northeast Manatee County. Basically a little gas station, a little convenience store, not much else.
Ed had been dead for several hours, shot multiple times, his throat slashed.
It was really the gunshots that were the fatal injuries.
It was pretty brutal. I mean, 3 shots point blank to the head.
Now what the investigators needed to do was to find Ed's wife, Jackie, and notify her of his death. And that wasn't quite as simple as it sounded.
Jackie was actually at my mother's home in Winter Haven, Florida. My mother had just had surgery, and she was helping my mother.
When the authorities finally tracked her down, Jackie appeared devastated by the news. Devastated and confused.
She has no idea why her husband would have been out at the Oasis.
Ed's family was just as devastated when the authorities knocked on their door later that same evening.
The police said, "You're the parents of Edward Postma." And we said, "Yes." And they said, "Well, we're sorry to inform you, but your son's been murdered." And it took a second or two for that to sink in. And I said, "What do you mean murdered?"
I didn't know what to think. I was stunned.
By the end of the night, the entire extended family had crowded into the couple's new home to console Jackie.
She was devastated, crying, really upset. Everybody was there gathered around her.
Jackie was still upset, but not as tearful the next day when she sat down with the investigators to answer a few questions.
We're looking at several things here. We're looking at maybe somebody being mad at your husband.
When Jackie said no, that Ed didn't have any enemies, the investigators tried a different possibility, one that might explain how Ed had ended up in a deserted parking lot in the middle of the night.
Have you ever doubted your husband in any way? Okay, so he's never given you anything to question him about as to being another woman?
Jackie said that she and Ed had been happily married for 5 years. In fact, Friday had been their anniversary. But since she had been at her mother's, they had been unable to celebrate. And that may have solved the mystery of how Ed ended up at the Oasis sometime Saturday night.
Ed may have been coming out to visit her for their anniversary. That's one of the things she speculated.
Because our anniversary was Friday, and I hadn't seen him.
Okay, it could be. He would be taking that way to go there.
The road that the Oasis is on is a travel route between here and Winter Haven, so it did make sense.
Although if that was true, Ed must have meant the visit to be a surprise. Jackie told the investigators she had spoken to Ed on the phone at around midnight, and he hadn't mentioned coming to see her.
He told you he was at home?
See you the next day, stop anniversary. He didn't even have a stand.
But if Ed had said that to Jackie, he'd been lying. The investigators based their assumption on a receipt they had found stuffed inside Ed's wallet.
The receipt was for 12:10 a.m., where he bought gas. He called you at 12:11, 1 minute later. Okay? So, if he told you he was at home, he wasn't.
Maybe Ed was coming out to surprise Jackie, just as she said. But there was still one puzzling thing about the gas receipt. It wasn't from the Oasis. Why would Ed pull into the convenience store if he'd already stopped elsewhere?
He can just help somebody.
Ed Postma was a great guy. I mean, take his shirt off his back. He was always there if you needed him.
The investigators conceded that it was possible that someone faking a breakdown had lured Ed off the road. But there was one detail that didn't seem to fit. The fact that his wallet had been left in the trunk, undisturbed.
He would have been robbed. Why would somebody kill somebody just to kill him?
And that brought the investigators back to the question they had started with. Was it possible Ed was having an affair?
I don't know if he was going to see her, if he went to meet somebody there. That's why we're asking you these questions.
But Jackie, who'd so recently settled into a seemingly picture-perfect suburban life with Ed, appeared unwilling to consider the possibility that Ed was having an affair. But while Jackie didn't want to doubt Ed, the investigators would soon be doubting her. It started with a phone call that came in on the 24th. 4 days after Ed had been found murdered.
Fairly early on in the investigation, law enforcement started receiving anonymous information that she'd been having an affair.
The caller didn't give details, but perhaps Jackie would. Later that same day, the investigators asked her to come in for another interview and told her about the tip.
Of course, it could be a crank call, but I have to tell you what was said, and I need to get your response. Just wanted to know if you knew that his wife was having an affair, according to some friends of hers.
Jackie denied the accusation, but the investigators kept pressing, assuring her that if she was having an affair, it was okay to own up to it.
We could care less, but if something like that was happening, we'd have a boyfriend that's mad, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that's what I'm looking at.
Right.
If it happened, you need to tell me. If it didn't, tell me no.
However, the investigators weren't about to take Jackie at her word. Once the interview was over, they pulled her phone records.
It didn't take rocket science to, pinpoint just who was communicating with who and when.
And based on those records, Jackie had recently been spending a lot of time communicating with a truck driver named Michael Cordes.
Phone call after phone call after phone call before, during, and after the murder.
Were the investigators that lucky? Had Jackie's phone records really pointed them to the killer? When they pulled Michael Cordes's police record, the theory sounded at least slightly plausible.
Mike Cordes was a long-time two-bit criminal, not too much of a violent past, lots of arrests, nearly a dozen.
He'd written bad checks. There was, I think, a domestic dispute.
But how did Jackie know the two-bit criminal? After a few discreet inquiries with Jackie's friends, the investigators discovered that they had met through Michael's mother, a neighbor of the Postmas at the old apartment complex.
She was a friend of Jackie's. And Michael Cordes had moved in with his mom when he got out of prison.
The meeting had occurred in June, barely 2 months before Ed's murder.
She had been hanging out with her friends.
Jackie had apparently fallen for the handsome bad boy.
Mike's a charismatic individual. He makes a very good impression upon you right away. He was a good-looking fella. He was well-spoken.
And according to her old neighbor, it wasn't long before Jackie and Michael were sleeping together.
They met at the apartment complex during the day while Ed was at work.
She was having an affair, a very intense affair.
And she had apparently done little to hide the relationship.
There was considerable evidence of the affair.
Jackie had gone to his workplace. She had been introduced as his girlfriend.
However, hints about Jackie's new boyfriend had soon gotten back to Ed.
Some of his friends would come and drop hints, but they never told Ed because they didn't want to hurt him.
But while no one had come right out and told Ed about the affair, he had apparently gotten the point. At least that's what the investigators figured based on a conversation one friend recalled having with Ed just days before his murder.
She had asked him about Michael Cordes and asked if Michael Cordes was a friend of his, and Edward Postma said, "He's no friend of mine."
Coming up, the investigators confront Jackie about her affair.
You love him?
And a witness comes forward with a stunning confession.
Blew this case wide open.
By mid-September 2000, it had been more than 3 weeks since Jackie Postma's husband, Ed, had been found murdered in a convenience store parking lot in Manatee County, Florida.
Jackie was the grieving widow. She was really upset, torn apart.
Or was it, as the investigators were beginning to wonder, simply an act?
She had repeatedly lied during a series of interviews.
Most of Jackie's lies revolved around the affair that she had been having with a truck driver and ex-con named Michael Cordes.
There were phone records that were replete with calls between Jackie's phone and Michael Cordes' phone. At the same time that these records are being discovered, all kinds of information is coming in about the affair between Jackie Postma and Michael Cordes.
Several of Ed's friends told the investigators that he had found out about the affair, or at least had strong suspicions.
He had told some of his friends that he knew the marriage was over.
And then, in a follow-up interview with Ed's parents, they filled the investigators in on a telephone conversation they'd had with Ed just 4 days before his death, while Jackie was visiting her sick mother in Winter Haven. During the phone call, Ed had told his parents that he was considering a divorce.
He goes, as soon as Jackie gets home, we're going to have a sit down. And he goes, I may actually leave her this time.
Did Jackie know what Ed was planning? Was it possible she had decided to preempt the divorce? On September 15th, Jackie returned to the police station for a third round of questioning. And they opened by asking her about her affair with Michael.
This time, I want you to be truthful with me, okay?
She admits that she'd been having an affair with Michael Cordes.
Although according to Jackie, the affair wasn't serious, at least not on her part.
You love him? Did you ever love him?
No, I like spending time with him.
But she also claimed that Michael wanted their affair to be more than just a fling.
He kept telling me that he wanted me to leave Ed. He told me that I needed to ask Ed for a divorce and that he would be there for me and he would help take care of my kids and all of that.
Jackie said that she had told Michael no, that she wasn't interested in leaving Ed.
That was not an option right now, that my kids need me and my mom needs me.
That's what Jackie claimed, but the investigators had reason to doubt her. According to both her phone records and Michael's, they had spoken just an hour before Ed's murder. Confronted about the phone call, Jackie admitted to talking to Michael on the night of Ed's murder, although according to her, the phone call was entirely innocent, at least as far as she knew.
He told me he was in Texas and that he was tired.
But if that was really what Michael had said, it was as much of a lie as what her husband had supposedly told her that same night.
And he wasn't in Texas. He was in Palmetto, Florida.
And within an hour of that phone call, according to the investigators' theory, Michael would murder Ed.
He was the only thing standing between you and Michael.
In the interrogation room, Jackie admitted that the affair gave Michael a motive to murder her husband. But she also told the investigators that if they were right and Michael had killed Ed, he had acted alone.
Divorce is easier than this. I would have divorced him if I wanted to leave.
He never told you anything about planning to kill your husband?
No, sir.
Once again, the investigators let Jackie go. But that didn't mean they believed her denials. After all, it wouldn't be the first time she had lied to them.
She had repeatedly lied that she had not been having an affair.
The question was, could they find evidence to prove that she was lying? The most promising lead came on September 26th, 11 days after Jackie denied knowing anything about Ed's murder. While questioning a relative of Michael's, she gave the investigators the name of another ex-con and friend of Michael's, Todd Martin.
Todd Martin knew Cordes from a time that they'd both spent in the county lockup.
Not exactly the brightest guy, but not a long-time criminal by any means. You know, a couple of marijuana arrests here and there.
He was approached by law enforcement. They asked to speak with him. He went down to the Criminal Investigation Bureau and gave a statement.
In fact, he ended up giving the investigators far more than that.
Todd Martin was the one that blew this case wide open.
Todd told the investigators he had been hanging out with Michael Cordes on the afternoon of August 19th when his friend asked him a favor.
Cordes had told Todd there was going to be a fight and he needed Todd there for backup.
He said, yeah, it sounds like fun. Something to do on a Saturday night.
Todd said that the man Michael had been planning to fight was Ed Postma. And according to Todd, Jackie was in on it.
Michael and Todd went to Winter Haven. They picked up Jackie's car.
Todd said that after picking up Jackie's car, he and Michael had driven out to the Oasis.
There's nothing around it. No houses, no businesses. It is the perfect place to stage an ambush.
And according to Todd, it was Jackie who baited the trap.
They parked the car with the hood up, with the idea that Jackie would call Ed and say, the car's broken down, can you come?
Todd told the police that he and Michael had laid in wait for maybe half an hour before Ed's truck pulled into the convenience store parking lot.
He watches Ed go to this car, you know, with the hood up, calling Jackie, Jackie, Jackie.
Mike Cord stepped out from the shadows with a gun and shot him 4 times in the head.
Todd was shocked by that, and he expected that there was going to be a fight.
Todd said he was even more shocked when Michael handed him a knife and told him to finish off Ed.
Cordes directed him to cut his jugular to make sure that he is dead.
Todd admitted that he had done as ordered.
Todd did, in fact, take a knife, and he did cut Ed Postma's throat. The reason that it was done was because he was, in fear for his own life.
He said, after all, I'd just seen him kill somebody.
After taking his statement, they placed Todd Martin under arrest.
The prosecutor on the case charged him with 2 counts. The first was attempted first-degree murder with a deadly weapon, and the second count was accessory after the fact to first-degree murder.
Within hours, the investigators had also arrested Michael Cordes.
The primary charge against Michael was the first-degree murder of Ed Postma.
Michael refused to talk, but by the end of the day, the investigators had brought Jackie in too. And once ushered into the interrogation room and informed that Todd and Michael had already been arrested for Ed's murder, she had little choice but to come clean.
In her final interview, she admits that she'd given her car to Mr. Cordes.
She also confessed to luring Ed out to the Oasis.
Told Ed that I had my nuggets.
However, while she now admitted to being in on the plot, Jackie maintained that she had no idea that Mike was planning to kill Ed.
He wanted Ed to know about us. And that he thought that Ed should know so that Ed could make up his mind and decide whether he wanted to stay with me or not. And I told him that I didn't want to tell him. That I was scared to tell him. And he said, well, he would do it.
In fact, Jackie claimed that when Michael called her after the murder, he still didn't tell her what had happened.
He told me that it was all taken care of and everything was fine.
And according to Jackie, she had been as surprised as anyone when the authorities contacted her the following Sunday and told her that Ed had been murdered.
I thought they were going to just talk. That's all he said he was going to do. I didn't know that he was going to shoot Ed. I did not know. If I knew that, I wouldn't have sent Ed there. I would not have sent him there. I thought this was going to end in divorce.
But if that was true, if Jackie had been as shocked by the murder as she claimed, the investigators had one more question.
Why didn't you tell us this from the beginning?
Because I was scared.
She was shocked, to hear that Mike murdered Ed, And that's why she didn't come forward, because she felt threatened by him too.
But since they had already caught Jackie in so many lies, the investigators didn't believe a word of it.
You know what this looks like? That you set this up.
Now convinced that Jackie had masterminded her husband's murder, Manatee County Sheriff's deputies placed her under arrest on October 3rd.
Nobody wants to believe that somebody would brutally murder their husband like that, in that manner. But the evidence told a different story.
On October 14th, after spending 2 weeks in jail under arrest for Ed's murder, Michael Cordes finally made a statement to the authorities.
He actually, against advice of counsel, goes to the detectives and makes a statement.
He started his statement by giving the investigators a confession to the affair.
Started dating Jackie a few weeks after I came out of jail. I guess it's like the first part of July.
There was a lot of evidence that Michael and Jackie had been carrying on an affair, but that's a far different claim than murder.
And when it came to murder, Michael swore he was innocent.
I didn't murder nobody. I don't murder people.
But someone had murdered Ed Postma, and if Michael didn't do it, who did?
I would have to point to Todd.
And Todd's motive for murdering Ed. According to Michael, Jackie paid him.
Todd said he could use the money.
Coming up, a surprise witness adds a new twist to the case.
I wish the son of a bitch was dead.
And Jackie has a surprise of her own.
No one knew whose baby it was.
When Jackie Postma's trial began at the Manatee County, Florida courthouse on July 6, 2001, her husband Ed had been dead for almost a year. Charged with first-degree murder, Jackie was accused of masterminding the ambush that left him dead in the parking lot of a rural convenience store.
By outward appearances, she looked like the typical loving wife, who you wouldn't at first suspect would be capable of this type of crime. But as you peel back the layers, it was a different story.
At least that's what the prosecutors and her family believed.
When she got charged, the siblings kind of turned their back on her.
We had made some of our own deductions, if you will, at that point. I was no longer surprised.
However, Jackie did have one more surprise in store for everyone. She was pregnant.
Jackie was pregnant when they took her in to the county jail.
And in April of 2001, 7 months after her arrest, she gave birth to a son.
No one knew whose baby it was.
Was Jackie's late husband the father? Or was it her former lover?
You had people wondering if it was Ed's baby, hoping it wasn't Ed's baby, wondering if it was Mike. I mean, it had a soap opera feel.
It wasn't until that July, just 3 days before going on trial, that a paternity test finally solved the mystery. The baby was Ed's. But according to the prosecutors, the fact that Jackie had been carrying Ed's baby didn't mean she hadn't killed him.
I believe Jackie Postma is selfish, devoid of any empathy or compassion.
In their open, the prosecutors argued that Jackie, facing the prospect of a divorce, had put her lover up to Ed's murder.
She wanted his life insurance in the house, but she didn't want him anymore, and she didn't want to get a divorce.
She manipulated Mr. Cordes. Whether she truly had feelings for him, maybe she did. She was perfectly willing to throw him under the bus at the end because she implicated him in her last statement.
In fact, the prosecutors claimed Jackie's multiple statements proved just how manipulative she could be.
At first, she denied having any knowledge whatsoever of this, and eventually, over time, when she gave subsequent statements, she confessed and admitted to little bits and pieces of things that just didn't add up.
Jackie had told so many false stories. Sometimes that can be more persuasive to a jury than a series of admissions. She had lied repeatedly.
But according to the prosecutors, there was one member of the murder conspiracy who had told the truth: Todd Martin. In June of 2001, a month before Jackie's trial, Todd had pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact to Ed's murder.
He was driven by that feeling that he should have done something, that perhaps there was some way that this could have been prevented.
Todd had been sentenced to 12 years in prison in exchange for his testimony against both Jackie and Michael.
He was instrumental because he actually was the only person there, the only eyewitness, the only one who could actually walk the jury through step by step.
And when Todd took the stand, that was precisely what he did.
The testimony was that Jackie Postma gave Todd Martin and Michael Cordes her Honda, her car, so that Ed would recognize it.
Everything that he said happened matched with the evidence that they had.
But then, on cross-examination, Todd's testimony took a potentially disastrous turn for the prosecutors, arguing that Jackie had only intended for Michael to beat Ed up, not murder him. The defense asked Todd to recall exactly what she had said when they picked up her car.
Mr. Martin claimed that as he left Jackie, Jackie said, "Don't hurt him too bad."
Had the prosecution's star witness just ruined their case?
The jury might feel that Jackie did not intend for her husband to be killed because of that statement.
Luckily, the prosecutors had a witness who would say otherwise. Her name was Chrissy Rogers, a friend of Michael's. She testified that she and her boyfriend Ed Turner had met Jackie a few weeks before the murder.
Edward Turner was introduced to Jackie Postma, and when she heard his name was Ed, she said, "Oh, that's my husband's name."
And then, according to Chrissy, Jackie had gone on to say something else.
I wish the son of a bitch was dead.
And according to Chrissy, it wasn't just idle talk.
She proceeded to offer him $6,000 to kill Edward Postma.
Jackie said it'd be 1,000 now and 5,000 later in 30 days.
However, according to Ed Turner's testimony, he'd rejected Jackie's offer, letting the whole thing drop until they saw the news about the murder.
They never reported this to the police or anything like that until, Ed is found dead.
When it was the defense's turn to present their case, Jackie's attorneys did their best to brush off Turner and Rogers' testimony. Instead, they focused on the fact that Jackie was miles away when her husband was murdered.
The defense was Jackie Postma did nothing. Jackie Postma didn't go out to the scene. Jackie Postma didn't pull the trigger.
According to the defense, the man who allegedly pulled that trigger, Michael Cordes, was the real mastermind behind Ed's murder.
Defense ultimately rested upon her final statement to the police, which was that she knew they were going out to meet him, to meet Ed Postma, but that she didn't know Ed Postma was going to be killed.
And they rested without calling Jackie to the stand.
For a defendant to testify, they then opened the door to a full cross-examination where the prosecutor then can go through bit by bit and piece by piece. What about this? What about that? You said this, you said that.
Jackie was a significant presence in the courtroom, however.
Throughout the trial, she would get emotional and she was crying, breaking down.
And when the case went to the jury, it was clear that she was counting on her hysterics to secure an acquittal.
She expected to get off looking all sad and pitiful.
Coming up, the jury announces its decision.
And we were kind of blown away.
And then Ed's family faces a bitter disappointment.
The whole family was stunned.
On July 13, 2001, after 5 hours of deliberation, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the trial of Jackie Postma. The 31-year-old faced first-degree murder charges for allegedly masterminding the death of her husband, Ed, who had been gunned down in a convenience store parking lot in August of 2000.
This was a brutal murder. I mean, this was premeditated. I mean, they had set him up to be murdered.
At trial, the defense had argued that she was innocent. claiming that her lover, an ex-con named Michael Cordes, was the one behind the murder.
Jackie's defense was she had an affair, she did nothing else. She would never kill her husband.
When the verdict was read, it was clear who the jury had believed.
The defendant is guilty of murder in the second degree, a lesser included offense.
She broke down. I think she realized, just everything was crashing down on her.
However, in a surprising move, the conviction was for second-degree murder, not first.
We were kind of blown away, I was, at first.
I think it was kind of a compromise verdict. Some of the jurors might have said maybe she didn't know that they were really there to kill him.
But the difference in degree had little effect on the outcome. The judge sentenced Jackie to life without parole.
I was happy as a clam. Ding dong, the bitch is gone and in the slammer. was my exact words.
But there was no laughter on July 20th when the verdict was read in the murder trial of Michael Cordes.
He had a great defense attorney. They had gone after Todd Martin.
In particular, the deal Todd had cut with the prosecutors.
Here's this man who was up to this mess in his eyeballs, yet was getting a sweet deal from the prosecution.
They kind of really brought in some doubt on Todd's testimony.
And it worked. Just a week after Jackie's conviction, a different jury found Michael not guilty.
I was stunned. The whole family was stunned.
Michael Cordes walked out a free man. Something is not right.
But they take some solace in the fact that the person they hold most responsible for Ed's death will be in prison for the rest of her life.
Jackie is evil. Master manipulator, con artist, scammer. I'm glad she's where she's at.
Part 1. The Hook. In the early 1920s, the city of Hanover stood at a crossroads between recovery and despair. Germany was still struggling under the weight of a devastating war that had ended only a few years earlier. The scars of World War I were everywhere. Factories struggled. Families struggled. Entire communities struggled. Food shortages, unemployment, and uncertainty had become part of daily life. For many people, survival itself was a full-time occupation. Yet amid all these visible hardships, another crisis was unfolding quietly in the background. At first, nobody saw the full picture. The city continued its routines. Trains arrived and departed from Hanover's railway station. Workers searched for employment. Merchants sold whatever goods they could find. Parents worried about money, housing, and the future. Life moved forward even when it felt fragile. Then something disturbing began to emerge. Human remains were discovered near the Lane River. The discovery shocked local residents, but not necessarily because they immediately suspected a serial killer. Post-war Germany was a troubled place. Violence, poverty, and displacement were not uncommon. A single discovery, tragic as it was, did not automatically point toward a larger mystery. But the discoveries did not stop. More remains appeared. Then more. Questions began to spread through Hanover faster than answers. Were these unrelated deaths? Were they victims of accidents? Had criminal gangs become involved? Or was something far more sinister taking place beneath the surface of the city? No one knew. What people did know was that families were searching for loved ones. Across the city and beyond, young boys and young men had vanished. Some had left home in search of opportunity. Some had been struggling to survive on their own. Others had simply disappeared from the places where they were last seen. In many cases, there were few resources available to conduct extensive searches. The chaos of the era often swallowed missing person cases before they could receive meaningful attention. As rumors spread, fear slowly replaced uncertainty. The remains found near the river no longer seemed like isolated discoveries. Residents began asking difficult questions. How many people had disappeared? How long had this been happening? And perhaps most troubling of all, if these disappearances were connected, who was responsible? The answers would eventually lead investigators to a man who appeared, at least on the surface, entirely unremarkable. His name was Fritz Harmon. To some people, he was simply another familiar face around Hanover's railway station. He was known in the area. He could be friendly. He could be approachable. He could make conversation easily. In a city where countless strangers passed through every day, he rarely attracted the kind of attention that would cause alarm. That ordinary appearance will become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Because history often teaches us that danger does not always arrive wearing a recognizable face. Sometimes it arrives with a smile. Sometimes it offers help. Sometimes it appears exactly as the person you would least suspect. The railway station where Harmon spent much of his time was a place filled with vulnerability. It was where travelers arrived and departed. It was where people searched for opportunities. It was where those with nowhere else to go often gathered. Young people who were hungry, homeless, or desperate could easily be found there. For many of them, a friendly offer of assistance might have seemed like a stroke of luck. A meal, a place to sleep, the promise of work, the possibility of safety. These were not small things in post-war Germany. For someone struggling to survive, they could mean everything. And that reality would become central to understanding how one of Germany's most notorious criminal cases unfolded. The story of Fritz Harmon is often remembered because of the horrifying scale of his crimes. He would eventually be convicted of 24 murders, while some estimates suggested the true number of victims may have been even higher. The details of the case shocked Germany and drew attention far beyond Hanover. Yet focusing only on the killer risks missing a deeper truth. This story is also about the world that allowed vulnerable people to disappear. It is about boys and young men whose lives unfolded during one of the most unstable periods in modern German history. It is about families who waited for answers that never came. And it is about how social chaos can create opportunities for predators to operate unnoticed. As investigators would later discover, the emerging pattern was impossible to ignore. The remains found near the Lane River were not random. The growing number of missing youths was not merely a coincidence. Piece by piece, a larger and more terrifying picture began to form. But during those early days, nobody could yet see the entire image. They only saw fragments. A river giving up secrets. A city growing increasingly uneasy. Families searching for sons. Rumors spreading from street to street. And somewhere among the crowds of Hanover, a man who seemed to blend into the background. The investigation that followed would uncover crimes so shocking that Fritz Harmon would become known by names that still echo through criminal history today. The Butcher of Hanover. The Vampire of Hanover. The Wolfman. These names would appear in newspapers and public discussions long after his arrest. They reflected the horror people felt when the truth finally emerged. Yet at the beginning of this story, those names did not exist. There was only uncertainty, fear, and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The city did not yet know that one of the most notorious serial murder cases in German history was unfolding within its streets. It did not yet know how many lives had already been lost. It did not yet know how many warnings had gone unnoticed. What it knew was simple. Young people were disappearing. Human remains were being found. And somewhere in Hanover, the person responsible was still free. That is where our story begins. To understand how Fritz Harmon was able to commit so many murders before being stopped, it is necessary to understand the world in which those crimes occurred. The story does not begin with the killer. It begins with a society struggling to recover from catastrophe. It begins with thousands of ordinary people trying to rebuild their lives after one of the most destructive conflicts Europe had ever seen. And it begins with a generation of young people who found themselves especially vulnerable in the aftermath of war. When World War I ended in 1918, Germany entered a period of profound instability. The war had taken an enormous human and economic toll. Families mourned lost fathers, brothers, and sons. Industries struggled to adapt to a new reality. Jobs were scarce. Food was often difficult to obtain. Many people lived with uncertainty about what the future would bring. For adults, these hardships were severe. For children and teenagers, they could be devastating. Across Germany, countless young people found themselves living on the margins of society. Some came from families already struggling with poverty. Others had become separated from support networks. Some drifted from town to town, searching for opportunities that never materialized. Others gathered around transportation hubs, hoping that the next train might carry them toward a better future. Hanover's railway station became one of the places where these realities converged. Every day, travelers passed through its platforms. Workers arrived seeking employment. Families moved from one place to another. Among the crowds were boys and young men with few resources and few protections. They were not criminals. They were not statistics. They were human beings navigating circumstances largely beyond their control. Some were still children. Others stood on the threshold between adolescence and adulthood. Many were simply trying to survive. This environment created a tragic vulnerability. In stable times, a missing child might trigger immediate concern from relatives, neighbors, teachers, and authorities. But post-war Germany was not a stable environment. People moved frequently. Records were imperfect. Communication could be difficult. Economic pressures consumed attention. A disappearance could sometimes go unnoticed longer than it should have. This reality would later become one of the most painful aspects of the Harmon case. Many of the victims belonged to a population that society was already struggling to protect. They were young. They were vulnerable. And in many cases, they lacked the safety nets that might otherwise have shielded them from danger. The victims associated with Fritz Harmon were primarily boys and young men between approximately 10 and 22 years old. The exact details of every individual life are not preserved within the information available to us. But what remains clear is that these were young people with futures ahead of them. They had names. They had hopes. They had plans that would never be fulfilled. True crime stories often focus heavily on perpetrators. The killer becomes the center of attention while the victims fade into the background. Yet when examining a case like this, it is important to reverse that perspective. The most significant loss is not the downfall of a criminal. The greatest tragedy is the loss of human lives. Imagine a teenage boy arriving at a busy railway station with little money and nowhere secure to stay. Imagine another young man searching for work during a time when employment opportunities were scarce. Imagine someone who believed that tomorrow might offer a chance to improve his circumstances. These possibilities represent the human reality behind the statistics. We cannot reconstruct every conversation or every journey. We cannot know every dream that was interrupted. But we can recognize that each victim represented an individual life with value and meaning. For families, disappearances often created a different kind of suffering. The absence of answers can be as painful as the answers themselves. A parent waiting for a son to return home may initially assume there is an innocent explanation. Perhaps he found work elsewhere. Perhaps transportation delays prevented contact. Perhaps he would return tomorrow. Then tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. Gradually, hope begins to compete with fear. Questions multiply. Every knock at the door becomes significant. Every rumor feels important. Every piece of information becomes something to cling to. In the years during which Harmon committed his crimes, Many families found themselves trapped in that uncertainty. Some would never receive the answers they desperately sought, while vulnerable young people struggled to survive in Hanover. Fritz Harmon occupied a very different position within the same environment. Born in Hanover in 1879, he had accumulated a criminal history long before the murders that would eventually make him infamous. His record included theft, fraud, and sexual offenses involving minors. These offenses demonstrated a pattern of behavior that placed him in repeated conflict with the law. Yet despite this history, he remained a familiar figure in the city. One of the most unsettling aspects of many criminal cases is the contrast between public appearance and private behavior. People often expect dangerous individuals to appear obviously threatening. Reality is rarely that simple. According to descriptions from the period, Harmon was capable of appearing friendly and approachable. He could engage with people in ways that encouraged trust. Around Hanover's railway station, he became a recognizable presence. In a crowded urban environment, familiarity can create a sense of safety. A face seen repeatedly begins to feel less suspicious. A person who seems helpful becomes easier to trust. This dynamic was especially powerful when directed toward vulnerable young people who desperately needed assistance. Consider the circumstances from the perspective of a teenager with limited options. Food was scarce. Shelter was uncertain. Employment was difficult to find. If an older man appeared willing to help, the offer might seem impossible to reject. A place to sleep for the night could mean protection from a cold. A meal could mean relief from hunger. The promise of work could represent hope for the future. These needs were not luxuries. They were necessities. Harmon understood this reality. The environment surrounding Hanover's railway station provided access to exactly the type of individuals who were most vulnerable. Boys and young men facing hardship often had little reason to suspect that an offer of assistance concealed something far more dangerous. This ability to gain trust would become one of the central mechanisms through which his crimes were carried out. Yet it is important to remember that the success of this deception says more about the victims' circumstances than about any extraordinary skill possessed by the offender. The young people he targeted were navigating a society already under immense strain. They were responding to offers that addressed real needs. They were making decisions within the limits of the options available to them. In many ways, the broader social conditions of post-war Germany became an invisible character in this story. Economic instability created desperation. Desperation increased vulnerability. Vulnerability created opportunities for exploitation. None of these factors caused the murders. Responsibility for the crimes belongs solely to the perpetrator. But the conditions surrounding those crimes help explain why they remained hidden for so long. Looking back today, it is tempting to ask how so many disappearances could occur without immediate intervention. Yet historical context matters. Investigators, families, and communities were operating within a period of enormous upheaval. The systems designed to protect vulnerable people were strained by challenges that affected every aspect of daily life. This does not excuse failures. It helps explain them. As the years passed, more young people vanished. Somewhere within Hanover, a pattern was developing. But patterns are often difficult to see while they are still forming. Individual disappearances could be interpreted in many ways. Young people moved frequently. Communication was inconsistent. Economic migration was common. The warning signs existed, but they remained fragmented. Meanwhile, Fritz Harmon continued to move through the city as a seemingly ordinary man. Around the railway station, he blended into the landscape of post-war Hanover. To many observers, he appeared unremarkable. Yet behind that ordinary appearance lay a reality that investigators had not yet uncovered. The vulnerable young people gathering around the station could not know that one of the greatest dangers they faced was not poverty, hunger, or homelessness. It was a man who understood their needs and intended to exploit them. And as the city struggled to recover from one crisis, another was already unfolding in its shadows. In the next chapter of this story, those shadows begin to take shape. We will examine how Harmon approached his victims, how he gained their trust, and how a series of disappearances gradually evolved into one of the most notorious murder cases in German history. By the early 1920s, Hanover was a city where thousands of people crossed paths every day without ever learning one another's names. The railway station stood at the center of this constant movement. Trains arrived carrying travelers, laborers, and young people searching for opportunities. Other trains departed carrying those same hopes toward uncertain destinations. To most citizens, the station was simply part of everyday life. But for Fritz Harmon, it offered something else. It provided access to a steady stream of vulnerable individuals. The station was more than a transportation hub. It was a place where social hardship became visible. Young people without stable homes could often be found nearby. Some had traveled in search of work. Some had left difficult situations behind. Others were simply trying to survive another day. Many possessed little money, few possessions, and limited support from family or institutions. These circumstances made them vulnerable to exploitation by anyone willing to take advantage of their situation. According to the available information, Harmon specifically targeted boys and young men between approximately 10 and 22 years old. His victims were not selected randomly. They belonged to a group already exposed to significant risks because of the conditions surrounding post-war Germany. Their vulnerability became a factor that he repeatedly exploited. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case is the simplicity of the approach. There was no elaborate scheme. There was no need for complex deception. Instead, Harmon relied on something far more effective, offering what desperate people genuinely needed: food, shelter, work, assistance. These were powerful promises during a period of economic hardship. Imagine standing in a crowded railway station after days of uncertainty. Imagine having little money, nowhere safe to stay, and no clear plan for the future. Then imagine meeting someone who appears friendly and willing to help. Someone who seems familiar with the area. Someone who speaks confidently and offers immediate solutions to urgent problems. Under those circumstances, accepting help could seem entirely reasonable. This reality is important because it shifts our understanding away from the false assumption that victims somehow made poor decisions. The truth is that many of the choices available to vulnerable youths during this period were already constrained by poverty and instability. Accepting assistance from a seemingly trustworthy adult may have appeared to be the safest option available. Harmon understood this. He reportedly offered food, shelter, or employment opportunities. In some situations, he allegedly presented himself as someone connected to authority or capable of helping navigate official matters, whether through friendliness, confidence, or the appearance of legitimacy. He created opportunities to gain trust. Trust became the doorway through which his crimes were committed. Once he established that trust, he persuaded victims to accompany him to his residence or rented room. This stage of the process transformed a public encounter into a private situation. The railway station was crowded and visible. His living quarters were not. The move from public space to private space represented a critical turning point. For the victims, it may have felt like the beginning of safety. For Harmon, it was the beginning of control. The available evidence indicates that victims were brought into an environment where they became increasingly vulnerable. Some were reportedly given alcohol or otherwise placed in situations where their ability to recognize danger was reduced. Again, it is important to remember that these actions occurred within relationships built upon deception. The victims believed they were receiving help. They did not understand the intentions of the man they had trusted. What happened next would eventually become one of the most infamous aspects of the entire case. According to the information later revealed during the investigation and prosecution, Harmon murdered his victims through strangulation and by biting their throats. This disturbing method contributed significantly to the nicknames that would later be associated with him, particularly the Vampire of Hanover. The details remain shocking even by the standards of notorious criminal cases. Yet it is important to approach them with restraint and focus. The significance of these acts lies not in their sensational nature, but in the suffering they caused and the lives they ended. Many victims died from suffocation or blood loss. Each death represented the destruction of a future. Each death meant that somewhere a family member, friend, or acquaintance would never see that person again. Each death expanded a tragedy that remained largely hidden from public view. What makes serial murder cases particularly difficult to comprehend is repetition. A single homicide is devastating. Repeated killings carried out over years reveal a pattern of sustained violence that can seem almost impossible to understand. Yet, according to the information available, Harmon continued offending over an extended period. Again and again, vulnerable young people disappeared. Again and again, the broader circumstances of post-war Germany obscured the pattern. Again and again, lives were lost. After the murders, the crimes did not end. The concealment of evidence became another central component of the case. Investigators would later learn that victims' bodies were dismembered. Remains were disposed of in the Lane River and in isolated locations. This method served two purposes. First, it helped conceal the crimes themselves. Second, it made identifying victims far more difficult. In any homicide investigation, identifying the victim is often the first crucial step toward identifying the perpetrator. When remains are fragmented or separated from personal belongings, that process becomes dramatically more challenging. The disposal of remains in the river would later play an important role in exposing crimes. But for years it helped obscure their full scale. Another troubling aspect of the case involved the victim's possessions. According to available information, Harmon kept clothing, identification papers, and other personal property belonging to those he killed. Some of these items were reportedly sold through black market channels. Others were allegedly passed to Hans Granz, a figure whose name became associated with the case. These actions reveal an additional layer of exploitation. The victims were not only deprived of their lives, their belongings were treated as commodities. Objects that had once belonged to real people became items to be exchanged or sold. Clothing that had belonged to a young man searching for opportunity became merchandise. Personal documents that represented identity became property to be used by someone else. Such actions further illustrate the profound disregard for the humanity of the victims. As years passed, rumors began circulating within Hanover. Rumors often emerge in environments where facts are scarce and fear is abundant. In this case, one particularly disturbing allegation suggested that human flesh had been sold. The story spread widely enough to become permanently associated with discussions of the case. However, it is essential to draw a clear distinction between rumor and evidence. While the allegation became part of the public narrative surrounding Fritz Harmon, there was no conclusive evidence proving that such acts occurred. The existence of the rumor itself remains historically significant because it demonstrates the level of horror and anxiety generated by the investigation. Yet responsible examination of the case requires acknowledging that the claim was never definitively established. By this point in the story, an unsettling pattern had developed. Young boys and young men continued to disappear. Families continued to search for answers. A man with a history of criminal behavior continued moving through Hanover's railway district. Human remains were being concealed. Personal possessions were being taken and redistributed. And still, the full truth remained hidden. Looking back today, it It may seem obvious that something terrible was happening, but historical events rarely appear obvious while they are unfolding. Investigators did not possess the complete picture. Families did not possess the complete picture. The public certainly did not possess the complete picture. Instead, there were fragments, individual disappearances, isolated concerns, rumors, suspicions, unanswered questions. The larger pattern existed, but it had not yet been fully recognized. In many ways, this period represents the darkest chapter of the entire case, because it was the period during which victims vanished without the broader public understanding what was occurring. The crimes thrived in secrecy. The killer relied on that secrecy. Every disappearance that failed to attract immediate attention strengthened the illusion that these were isolated events rather than components of a larger series of murders. Yet secrets have limits. Even the most carefully concealed crimes leave traces behind. Rivers return what they are given. Missing persons accumulate into patterns. Evidence survives. Questions persist. Eventually, the concealment that had protected Harmon for years would begin to fail. Human remains discovered near the Lane River would force investigators to confront a possibility that few had previously imagined. Reports of missing youths would become impossible to dismiss as unrelated incidents. Public concern would intensify. Authorities would come under increasing pressure to find answers. The chain of events that ultimately led to Fritz Harmon's downfall was already beginning. Neither the city nor the killer fully understood it yet. But the investigation that would expose one of Germany's most notorious serial murder cases was about to enter a new phase. The shadows that had concealed the crimes for so long were beginning to recede. And for the first time, the truth was starting to emerge. For years, the crimes associated with Fritz Harmon remained hidden behind a combination of fear, social instability, and circumstance. The victims were among the most vulnerable members of society. Many were young. Many had limited resources. Some disappeared into a post-war landscape already filled with uncertainty. As a result, the pattern that seems so obvious in retrospect was far less visible to those living through it. But eventually, the concealment began to fail. The turning point came when human remains were discovered near the Lane River. At first, these discoveries did not immediately reveal the existence of a serial killer. Investigators had to confront a difficult reality. Finding human remains answers one question while creating many others. Who was the victim? How did the person die? When did the death occur? Was the discovery connected to a crime, an accident, or something else entirely? In a city still dealing with the consequences of war and social disruption, such questions were not always easy to answer. Nevertheless, the discoveries could not be ignored. Human remains appearing in and around the river demanded attention. Residents of Hanover followed developments with growing concern. Newspapers and conversations throughout the city increasingly focused on the disturbing findings. What initially appeared to be isolated incidents began to feel like pieces of a larger mystery. As additional remains were found, public anxiety intensified. People wanted explanations. Families wanted answers. Authorities faced mounting pressure to determine what was happening. The investigation entered a critical phase. One of the greatest challenges in criminal investigations is recognizing patterns before they become overwhelming. Individual events can often be explained in isolation. A single missing person case may have numerous possible explanations. A single discovery of remains may point in multiple directions. But when investigators begin seeing similar circumstances repeated over time, patterns start to emerge. In Hanover, concerns about missing young people gradually became impossible to dismiss. Reports of disappearances had accumulated over an extended period. Boys and young men continued to vanish. Some had last been seen around areas connected to transportation and transient populations. Others simply disappeared from the routines of daily life. Taken individually, these cases may not have appeared connected. Viewed collectively, they suggested something far more alarming. The challenge facing investigators was that many of the missing individuals belonged to groups that often received less attention from society. They were frequently young, vulnerable, and economically disadvantaged. Some lacked stable homes. Others moved frequently. In an era without modern investigative databases, identifying connections between cases required significant effort. Information was scattered. Records were incomplete. Yet despite these obstacles, concern continued to grow. The discoveries near the Lane River forced authorities to look more closely at the possibility that the disappearances were related. The investigation increasingly focused on identifying who might have had contact with vulnerable young people in Hanover. This was an important development because serial offenders often rely on repeated access to a particular victim population. The more investigators examined the circumstances surrounding the disappearances, the more important this question became: who consistently interacted with these missing youths? As attention shifted toward the environments where vulnerable boys and young men gathered, certain individuals naturally attracted scrutiny. Among them was Fritz Harmon. By this stage, Harmon was not an unknown figure. He was already familiar within parts of Hanover, particularly around the railway station area. He spent considerable time in locations where young people seeking assistance could be found. This fact alone did not establish guilt. However, investigations often proceed through a process of narrowing possibilities. Detectives gather information, compare observations, and evaluate whether certain individuals might be connected to a pattern of events. As that process unfolded, suspicion increasingly moved toward Harmon. The exact sequence of every investigative step is not preserved within the source material available to us, but the overall progression is clear. First came the discovery of human remains. Then came increasing concern regarding missing youths. As evidence accumulated, investigators began examining individuals whose activities intersected with the victim's world. Eventually, attention focused directly on Harmon. This transition marked a decisive moment in the case. For years, the crimes had existed largely in darkness. Now investigators were beginning to move toward the source. Public pressure likely played an important role in sustaining momentum. Fear had spread throughout Hanover. People wanted reassurance that authorities understood the threat. Families wanted to know whether the disappearances of loved ones would finally be taken seriously. Every new development increased expectations that investigators would uncover the truth. Such pressure can be difficult for law enforcement agencies, but can also serve as a powerful motivation to pursue every available lead. As investigators examined Harmon more closely, evidence began linking him to the crimes. The available information states that evidence ultimately connected directly to his residence. This was a critical breakthrough. Criminal investigations often depend on transforming suspicion into evidence. Concerns, rumors, and theories are not enough. Authorities need facts that can withstand scrutiny. In this case, the investigation eventually produced exactly that. On June 22, 1924, Fritz Harmon was arrested. The arrest represented the culmination of months, and in some respects years, of unanswered questions. Yet it also marked the beginning of another phase of the investigation. Arresting a suspect is only one step. Investigators must then determine the full scope of the crimes and gather evidence capable of supporting prosecution. What authorities discovered after Harmon's arrest transformed the case from a disturbing investigation into one of the most notorious criminal scandals in German history. According to the information available, human bones were recovered and evidence connected directly to Harmon's apartment. These findings were enormously significant. Physical evidence provides a foundation that speculation cannot. It allows investigators to move beyond suspicion and establish concrete links between a suspect and criminal acts. The discoveries associated with Harmon's residence helped reveal the scale of what had occurred. The growing body of evidence painted an increasingly horrifying picture. What may once have appeared to be isolated disappearances now seemed interconnected. What may once have looked like unrelated discoveries near a river now appeared linked to a single individual. Piece by piece, investigators assembled a case that exposed years of violence. For the families of victims, these developments likely brought a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, evidence meant that authorities were finally uncovering the truth. On the other hand, each new discovery carried the possibility of confirming the worst fears imaginable. The transition from uncertainty to knowledge is not always comforting. Sometimes answers reveal tragedies far greater than anyone expected. One of the most shocking moments in the investigation came through Harmon's own statements. According to the available information, he confessed to the killings. Confessions can occupy a complicated place in criminal investigations. They may provide insight into a suspect's actions, but they do not erase the suffering caused by those actions, nor do they necessarily explain why the crimes occurred. In Harmon's case, his explanations were particularly disturbing. He reportedly claimed that he killed under the influence of an internal compulsion, describing his actions as driven by an uncontrollable urge. He also acknowledged biting victims during the killings and referred to this behavior using the phrase love bite. The phrase is deeply unsettling because of the contrast it creates. It attempts to attach language associated with affection to acts of extreme violence. For investigators, prosecutors, and the public, such statements offered no justification. Instead, they highlighted the profound disconnect between the killer's perspective and the devastating reality experienced by his victims. The confession became another piece of evidence supporting the broader case against him. Yet even as details emerged, many questions remained impossible to answer completely. Investigators could establish connections. They could recover evidence. They could document crimes. But they could never restore the lives that had been lost. They could never fully reconstruct every moment experienced by the victims. They could never erase the years during which families waited for answers. By the time the investigation reached this stage, Hanover had undergone a dramatic transformation in its understanding of the case. What began as isolated discoveries of human remains had evolved into the exposure of a serial murderer. What began as scattered disappearances had become evidence of a sustained pattern of violence. The city that once struggled to understand what was happening now faced a terrible truth. The evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward Fritz Harmon. The remains recovered from the Lane River, the missing youths, the findings connected to his residence, and his own admissions combined to form a picture that investigators could no longer ignore. The mystery that had haunted Hanover was finally beginning to unravel. But the investigation's ultimate purpose was not merely to identify a suspect. It was to bring that suspect before a court of law. The evidence gathered during the investigation would soon be presented in a legal proceeding that attracted enormous public attention. Germany wanted answers. Families wanted justice. And the man who had become the focus of one of the country's most shocking criminal investigations was about to face trial. By the time Fritz Harmon's case reached the courtroom, the city of Hanover had already been transformed by the investigation. What had begun as uncertainty and scattered discoveries had evolved into one of the most shocking criminal cases Germany had ever seen. The remains recovered near the Lane River, the growing number of missing youths, the evidence connected to Harmon's residence, and his own admissions had fundamentally altered public understanding of the tragedy. Now, the focus shifted from investigation to judgment. The question before the legal system was no longer whether something terrible had happened. The question was how the crimes would be addressed under the law and what consequences awaited the man accused of committing them. Public interest in the proceedings was immense. Cases involving multiple murders naturally attract attention. But the scale and nature of the accusations against Harmon elevated the trial into a national story. People across Germany followed developments closely. Newspapers reported on the case. Conversations in homes, workplaces, and public spaces returned repeatedly to the same subject. The crimes had generated fear, anger, and disbelief. Many struggled to comprehend how such acts could have occurred over an extended period within a major German city. For the families connected to the victims, the trial carried a different significance. Public curiosity and media attention were secondary concerns. What mattered most was accountability. For years, many families had lived with uncertainty. Some had endured the agony of not knowing what happened to loved ones. Others had watched the investigation unfold while hoping for answers. The courtroom could not undo their losses, but it represented an opportunity for the truth to be formally recognized. When legal proceedings begin in a major criminal case, the courtroom becomes a place where evidence is organized into a coherent narrative. Investigators gather facts. Prosecutors present those facts. Judges evaluate them according to the law. The process is designed to transform the discoveries of an investigation into legal findings capable of supporting a verdict. In Harmon's case, that process centered on an extraordinary number of victims. According to the available information, he was tried for 24 murders. Even by the standards of serious criminal prosecutions, this number was staggering. Each charge represented a life lost. Each charge reflected a separate act of violence. Together, they revealed a pattern that extended far beyond a single crime. The prosecution's task was to demonstrate that the evidence supported these charges. The available information indicates that investigators had already recovered significant physical evidence linking Harmon to the murders. Human remains had been found. Evidence connected to his residence had been documented. His own statements had become part of the investigative record. These elements formed the foundation of the case presented against him. Physical evidence often plays a central role in homicide prosecutions because it provides objective support for investigative conclusions. Human remains, recovered bones, and evidence associated with a suspect's living space can establish links that are difficult to dismiss. In this case, such evidence helped transform suspicion into legal proof. The prosecution could point to tangible findings rather than relying solely on speculation or rumor. Another important aspect of the proceedings involved Harmon's admissions. As discussed in the previous chapter, he reportedly confessed to the killings and described aspects of his behavior. Confessions can be powerful pieces of evidence because they come directly from the accused. However, courts typically evaluate confessions alongside other evidence rather than treating them as sufficient on their own. In this case, the admissions existed within a broader framework of physical findings and investigative discoveries. Together, these elements strengthened the prosecution's position. The courtroom also became a place where the scale of the tragedy was publicly acknowledged. Investigators had spent months assembling evidence, identifying patterns, and connecting disappearances to a single perpetrator. During the trial, those findings were presented in a structured and formal manner. The cumulative effect was devastating. What may once have seemed like isolated incidents now appeared as components of a prolonged campaign of violence against vulnerable young people. One of the most difficult realities in cases involving serial murder is that the full number of victims is not always known with certainty. According to the available information, Harmon was tried and convicted in connection with 24 murders. At the same time, some estimates suggested that the true number of victims may have been higher, possibly reaching 27 to 30 or more. The distinction between proven victims and suspected victims is important. Courts operate on evidence that can be established to the required legal standard. Historians and investigators may later debate whether additional crimes occurred, but legal judgments depend upon what can be demonstrated. As a result, the trial focused on the murders that authorities believed they could substantiate. This distinction reminds us of a broader truth about criminal investigations. Some questions receive definitive answers. Others remain partially unresolved. Evidence can illuminate much of the past, but it cannot always eliminate every uncertainty. For the families of those whose cases were proven, the proceedings provided a measure of recognition. For others, lingering questions may have remained. Public reaction to the trial reflected both horror and fascination. The details associated with the case challenged assumptions about safety, trust, and human behavior. Many people found it difficult to understand how a man who appeared ordinary to some observers could be responsible for such extensive violence. Others focused on the broader social failures that had allowed vulnerable youths to disappear over an extended period. The trial, therefore, became more than a legal proceeding. It became a national conversation about crime, vulnerability, and accountability. At the center of that conversation stood Fritz Harmon himself. Yet, despite the public attention directed toward him, the legal process remained focused on evidence rather than reputation. Nicknames such as the Butcher of Hanover and the Vampire of Hanover may have captured public imagination. But courtroom judgments depend upon facts. Investigators had gathered those facts. Prosecutors had presented them. The court now had to render a decision. Ultimately, the verdict was clear. Fritz Harmon was convicted of 24 murders. The conviction represented the culmination of the investigation that had begun with the discovery of human remains and expanded into one of Germany's most significant criminal cases. The court concluded that the evidence established his responsibility for the deaths associated with those charges. Following the conviction, the sentence imposed was death. At the time, capital punishment remained a legal penalty for crimes of this magnitude. The court determined that the severity of the offenses warranted the ultimate punishment available. Under the law, for some members of the public, the sentence may have appeared inevitable given the scale of the crimes. For others, it represented the legal system's attempt to respond proportionally to an extraordinary tragedy. Whatever individual opinions may have been, the verdict and sentence marked the formal conclusion of the judicial process. The legal system had reached its decision. Yet even after conviction and sentencing, one final chapter remained. In 1925, Fritz Harmon was executed by guillotine. With that execution, the life of the man responsible for the murders came to an end. From a legal perspective, the case was closed. The investigation had identified the perpetrator. The court had delivered a verdict. The sentence had been carried out. But legal closure and emotional closure are not the same thing. The execution could not restore the lives that had been taken. It could not erase years of suffering experienced by victims and their families. It could not undo the fear that had spread through Hanover. Nor could it answer every question raised by the case. Some mysteries remained. Some losses remained permanent. This distinction is important because true crime narratives often conclude with an arrest, conviction, or execution. Such endings create a sense of resolution. Yet real-life tragedies rarely end so neatly. The legal process may conclude, but the consequences continue. Families continue living with loss. Communities continue reflecting on what happened. Historians continue examining the lessons that can be learned. In the case of Fritz Harmon, the trial and execution marked the end of one story. The story of how a serial killer was identified, prosecuted, convicted, and punished. But another story remained. It was the story of the aftermath. It was the story of how Germany remembered the crimes. It was the story of what the case revealed about vulnerability, social neglect, and the protection of those most at risk. And it was the story of the victims whose lives continued to matter long after the courtroom proceedings had ended. Those questions and those legacies would endure far beyond the verdict itself. When Fritz Harmon was executed in 1925, the legal case against him came to an end. The investigation had identified the perpetrator. The court had delivered its verdict. The sentence had been carried out. On paper, the story appeared complete. Yet the true impact of the crimes did not end with the closing of a courtroom or the execution of a convicted murderer. The consequences would continue to echo through Hanover, through Germany, and through the lives of countless people touched by the tragedy. One of the first questions that remained after the trial concerned the full scale of the crimes. The court convicted Harmon of 24 murders. Those were the cases authorities believed they could establish through available evidence. However, even during and after the proceedings, some estimates suggested that the true number of victims may have been higher. Historical discussions of the case have frequently cited figures ranging from 27 to 30 victims or more. This uncertainty highlights a painful reality found in many serial murder investigations. Not every victim can always be conclusively identified. Not every disappearance can always be linked to a perpetrator with absolute certainty. Evidence may be lost. Records may be incomplete. Time may erase crucial details. As a result, some questions survive long after a case is officially closed. In the Harmon case, the distinction between confirmed victims and suspected victims remains an important part of its historical legacy. Yet regardless of whether the final number was 24, 27, 30, or more, the scale of suffering remains undeniable. Dozens of young lives were destroyed. Families were left searching for answers. Communities were forced to confront the reality that a predator had operated among them for years. Looking back from a modern perspective, one of the most difficult questions is how the crimes were able to continue for so long. This question is often asked whenever a serial offender remains active over an extended period. People naturally wonder whether warning signs existed and whether intervention could have occurred sooner. While there is no simple answer, the circumstances surrounding post-war Germany provide important context. The years between 1918 and 1924 were marked by extraordinary instability. Economic hardship affected millions of people. Food shortages created daily struggles. Unemployment generated uncertainty and desperation. Social institutions faced enormous challenges. Communities that might otherwise have been able to protect vulnerable individuals were often struggling merely to function. Within this environment, large numbers of young people found themselves exposed to risk. Some lacked stable housing. Some traveled in search of opportunities. Some existed at the edges of society where their disappearances were less likely to receive immediate attention. This does not mean their lives mattered less. Quite the opposite. Their vulnerability is precisely what makes the case so tragic. The victims were not forgotten because they were unimportant. They were overlooked because the systems that should have protected them were overwhelmed by broader social crises. This distinction is critical. Discussions of serial murder sometimes focus almost exclusively on the offender, as though the crimes emerged from nowhere. But crimes occur within social environments. Those environments can create opportunities for exploitation when vulnerable populations lack adequate protection. In the case of Fritz Harmon, the instability of post-war Germany became one of the factors that allowed the murders to remain hidden for so long. Understanding that reality does not reduce the killer's responsibility. It simply helps explain the conditions under which the crimes occurred. Another lasting consequence of the case was its influence on the study of crime itself. According to the available information, the Harmon case became one of the foundations for later criminological research in Germany. This development is significant because major criminal cases often reshape how societies think about violence, investigation, and prevention. Investigators, legal scholars, and criminologists examine such cases not out of fascination with the offender, but in hopes of understanding how similar tragedies might be prevented in the future. The Harmon case raised important questions. How should authorities identify patterns among missing person reports? How can vulnerable populations be better protected? What warning signs deserve greater attention? How can communities respond more effectively when disappearances begin to accumulate? These questions remain relevant today. Although investigative technology has improved dramatically since the 1920s, the underlying challenge remains the same: protecting those who are most vulnerable to exploitation. Cases like this remind us that effective prevention often depends on recognizing patterns early and ensuring that no person's disappearance is dismissed simply because of their social circumstances. The public memory of Fritz Harmon also evolved over time. His nicknames, the Butcher of Hanover, the Vampire of Hanover, and the Wolf Man, became embedded in popular discussions of the case. Such labels are common in notorious criminal investigations. They create memorable identities that media outlets and the public often repeat for decades. Yet there is a danger in allowing those labels to dominate the story. They can unintentionally shift attention away from the people who suffered most. The more a case becomes associated with a notorious nickname, the easier it becomes to forget the individuals whose lives were taken. This is why it is important, especially in the final chapter of a true crime story, to return our attention to the victims. The victims in this case were primarily boys and young men. Many were between 10 and 22 years old. Some were struggling with poverty. Some were searching for work. Some were trying to build lives in an uncertain world. Their stories were interrupted before they had the opportunity to unfold. We may not know every detail of their ambitions, friendships, or dreams. We may not possess complete biographies for every victim, but we do know enough to recognize their humanity. Each victim represented a unique individual. Each had a future that never arrived. Each left behind an absence that could never truly be filled. Consider what was lost. A young person searching for employment might have eventually built a career. A teenager traveling through Hanover might have formed a family of his own. A boy facing hardship might have survived difficult circumstances and gone on to live a long life. These possibilities disappeared alongside the victims themselves. One of the greatest tragedies of murder is not merely the life that ends in the present. It is the future that is stolen along with it. Families carried those losses long after newspaper headlines faded. For parents, siblings, relatives, and friends, the end of the trial could never restore what had been taken. Justice and healing are not identical concepts. A conviction may establish accountability, but grief continues to exist afterward. The passage of time changes the form of that grief, but it does not erase it. This reality is easy to overlook when examining historical cases. Dates, verdicts, and statistics can create emotional distance. Yet behind every number is a human story. Behind every confirmed victim is a family whose life changed forever. As we reflect on the case today, nearly a century after the events occurred, perhaps the most important lesson concerns visibility. Vulnerable people often become invisible within large social crises. When societies are overwhelmed by economic hardship, political instability, or other emergencies, attention naturally focuses on the most immediate challenges. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that predators exploit precisely these moments. They seek out individuals who are isolated, marginalized, or overlooked. The victims in the Harmon case belong to such a population. Their vulnerability was not a personal failure. It was a consequence of circumstances far beyond their control. Remembering that fact is essential. The story of Fritz Harmon is often presented as the story of a notorious serial killer. In one sense, that description is accurate. He remains one of Germany's most infamous murderers. His crimes shocked a nation and secured a place in criminal history. But if that is all we remember, we miss the deeper meaning of the case. At its heart, this is not merely the story of a killer. It is the story of vulnerable young people living through a period of extraordinary hardship. It is the story of disappearances that were not immediately understood. It is the story of families searching for answers. And it is the story of what can happen when society fails to see those who need protection most. We began this journey beside the Lane River, where human remains emerged from the water and forced the city to confront an uncomfortable truth. That river became a symbol of revelation. For years, the crimes had remained hidden. Then, slowly and relentlessly, evidence surfaced. Questions led to investigations. Investigations led to discoveries. Discoveries led to justice. Yet even after the mystery was solved, the most important truth remained unchanged. The true measure of this case is not the notoriety of Fritz Harmon. It is the lives of the boys and young men who never returned home. Their stories deserve to be remembered. Their humanity deserves to be recognized. And their loss remains the most enduring legacy of all.